First up, bushfires that ravaged so much of the country over the summer of 2019-20. What impact did they have on the Hunter and its wine industry, and how's the recovery going?
Look, the bushfires, a big year for us. The bushfires were certainly a factor, but in combination with the drought, it made vintage 2020 a real challenge for us. One of the most difficult vintage that I've experienced in my sort of 20 years in the wine industry. Even before the fire started in sort of late spring 19, after 4 years of drought, we were looking at, particularly here in the Hunter Valley, probably a 50% reduction in yield just due to the dry season. So we weren't looking down, although it stayed dry, and dry is generally a good indication that we'll have quality in terms of red wine here in the Hunter Valley. Yields were certainly an issue, and yields were certainly down to the point that we were looking on the cusp of it actually being an issue just from that front. The bushfires really took it to another level. Of the fruit we expected to take in spring 2019, 75% of my expected fruit did not come in due to a combination of reduced yields and the impact of smoke. So the bushfires, there's two impacts with bushfires in terms of viticulture. There is the obvious disastrous issue of fire and the loss of infrastructure and permanent plantings, which in New South Wales we were quite fortunate not to be too exposed with. There were some vineyards lost down in Tumbarumba in those awful fires down in southern New South Wales, but for the most part, the vineyard loss in 2020 was more in the Adelaide Hills region of South Australia. The bigger impact in 20 was smoke, and the way smoke works is that it's closely related to how close to the fire you are, how intense the fire is. But the long and the short of it is the smoke affects the flavour and taste of the grapes, and it's very sinister because invariably in a season that you have bushfire smoke or bushfire risk, it's a dry season, so fruit tends to be pristine. It looks incredibly high quality, but it has a taint, and it doesn't really reveal itself until you've actually gone through the process and cost of actually picking the fruit, fermenting the juice, and coming out with a finished wine. So you can have fruit that looks pristine on the vine, tastes fine in the glass or in the vineyard, but it doesn't start to reveal itself until after fermentation. So it's a relatively new issue. It really only came to being in since 2003, but since that time there's been a lot of research done, mainly in Australia, but there've also been issues in Chile and California, and there've been incredible developments in research and managing smoke in that time. So we did an enormous amount of testing, and it's a very variable impact. Some vineyards we didn't pick at all. Some vineyards we picked all of them and weren't impacted at all, and others sort of were somewhere in between. And this impact was very, very widespread. It really impacted the wine industry from in the north to in Port Macquarie, all the way down to Beechworth in Victoria. So through the Hunter Valley, out to Mudgee, Orange, Gundagai, Murray Bateman in Canberra, and in northeastern Victoria in Beechworth and Rutherglen. So it was incredibly widespread, and it even there were even traces of it found sort of down in the Riverina, but very variable. So it was a large impact, but it's quite amazing to think after 18 months of COVID that feels about 5 years ago, to be honest.
Yes, that was my next question, actually, because COVID wiped the bushfires from the headlines early last year. So what has the impact of the pandemic been for wineries? And I guess that includes labour, cellar door type activities, and then sales both here and overseas.
It's been very widespread, Karen, through in all facets that you just mentioned. So getting harvest staff for vintage 2021 was very difficult, but we managed to get through. I think going to 22, it's going to be, as it's been publicised, is going to be a much larger issue. This year we had the last hangers on, I guess, that were still backpacking around on their already here. They've certainly all gone home. So I think picking going into 22 is going to be a real issue. I expect to see a lot more machine picking than what we'd normally do, and hand pickers being a real being very light on the ground. So labour's been an issue, certainly, and just getting vintage crew to work in the winery. Like I'd normally see somewhere in the vicinity of 50, 60 applications to work harvest here at Brokenwood, and I think I've had a dozen. I've had to advertise this year, which I haven't had to do in my time here at Brokenwood. So I think getting boots on the ground is certainly going to be an issue. The big driver, though, has been reaching our customers. So whether that's our cellar doors being closed for the best part of 6 months out of the last 18. So visitation here to the Hunter Valleys has dried right up, but the impact's also been on on-premise venues. So restaurants, obviously they haven't been operating, so that access to that market's been quite challenging, and restaurateurs and bar owners, et cetera, have obviously been doing it quite tough. So it's going to be a bit of a different environment as to who's still there and how they operate when we come back. And I guess the other big the positive, though, has been retail's been quite good. So retail's been on a bit of a slide over the last sort of 10 years with a consolidation of the market in terms of Coles and Woolworths really taking a stronghold of bottle shops. But people have been locked down and they've been not going out, and they have been drinking at home, and they've been buying wine from retail shops. So retail's done quite well. So that has been a bit of a silver lining to companies like Brokenwood that have a retail presence. If you're a small family-owned cellar door that's really reliant on tourism or the on-premise market, has been a very difficult 18 months. And if you're interstate, I guess here in the Hunter Valley or in Orange or Mudgee, when we do open up, getting to Sydney is going to be quite relatively easy. If your business is based in Adelaide or southwest Western Australia, getting to the largest market in the country is going to be a challenge.
Yeah, right. And then, of course, many people are aware China's been putting massive tariffs on some agricultural products from Australia, including wine. Yeah. So that's, I'm assuming, had an impact as well. How's that going?
Look, for us, it hasn't been big. We're not a big exporter. We're about over 80% of our sales are domestic. So personally, it hasn't been too bad, but certainly it's a big thing. And we've really been rolled up in as collateral damage, to be honest. It's Australia's largest export market, but effectively, I can't see it coming back anytime soon. It's until the geopolitical scenario changes or tempers. China is not going to be a viable option for Australia, to the point that there are larger companies that the only way they're selling wine into China is through putting their brand on South African or Chilean or French bulk, because Australian wine's it's literally priced out of the market, and the chance of that changing in the short term, I'd say, is very low.
Yeah, that doesn't sound very good. So you mentioned the labour issue.
Yeah.
For this coming season, what's the actual season looking like with hopefully drought, bushfires, those sorts of issues?
Look, it's been interesting. I don't mean to sound all doom and gloom. The vintage 2021 was a good one, coming off a low yield. It's actually the largest national crush we've had on record. So over 2 million tonnes were crushed nationally, and that covers everywhere from the Hunter Valley through to the Riverina, the warm inland climates. There's a lot of wine made in 2020 and in 2021. 2020 was a low yielding year, so things are a bit more of an even keel. We've had good winter rain. I think particularly southern New South Wales, South Australia, Victoria, they've had a very wet winter. So I think there'll be a big crop on the ground coming into vintage 22, and it will just come down to whether the weather holds. Basically, in terms of for the Hunter Valley, I sort of think if the northwest croppers are having a great time, where in terms of yield, we tend not to have as good a year because it means there's a fair bit of rain about that can equal a bit of a drier season, a tougher year for us with harvest rain. The other side is true when cropping, when we're in a dry cycle and drought is around, we tend to have a better run in terms of reds, particularly in the Hunter Valley, because we just missed that late summer rain, which is really what drives quality here in the Hunter Valley. So rainfall from about New Year's on makes things pretty challenging for us, and but I expect a big crop in terms of yield and quality. We'll see what comes over the next few months. There's a bit to come, but growth should be good.
Well, look, he's hoping that the weather is nice to you for a change.
That's all right. Well, it's no one gets into agriculture if you're risk averse.
No, this is
or if you're not an optimist, I guess.
Very, very true.
I'm really curious around the smoke information you shared earlier on. So you didn't realise the smoke was affected in the grape until the process is completed. What actually happens to the taste? What does it taste of when it's smoke affected?
Well, look, we knew we were going to be impacted. It was to the level that we were going to be impacted. So, look, there's a background of these compounds occur in grapes naturally. It's just threshold that we worry about. So small amounts aren't the end of the world. It's not to say I guess what we talk about all the time with winemaking, and it's the same with cooking or anything else, it's just balance. If one thing's jumping up and shouting at you, it's probably a bit out of balance. So how smoke reveals itself, and it sometimes can be, I guess for whiskey drinkers out there, the idea of a smoky whiskey sounds fantastic. But the way it reveals itself in wine is a much more, it's not peaty and smoky, it's more ashy and campfire in it. It makes the wine appear bitter or acrid, and it's quite unpleasant. And one of the other issues with it is that although it doesn't really reveal itself, it's quite a sinister thing because it actually just tends to get worse in bottle as well. So if you go to the work of picking the grapes, fermenting, making the wine, maturing them in barrel, and then bottling them, it can actually look quite good up until maybe a few months in, by which point you can have a large volume of wine that may not be usable. So one of the great things that's come about with the research that's been done on it over the last coming up 20 years is we've learnt that the best, whilst a hard decision, it's often best to not pick the grapes, because you can end up with some wine that owes you a lot of money and having to downgrade it. So I guess in 2020, a lot of our single vineyard wines, like Graveyard, for example, were not made. We're able to do a lot of testing on things and make wines like our Hunter Valley Shiraz, like our Hunter Valley Semillon, but making those top-end premium wines that people sell for a long time, that was not a risk that we were willing to take.
Yeah, thank you. That's good. Interesting. Over to you, Walt.
Thanks, Dave. Stuart, thanks for the presentation. As a family that's interested in Persia, Shiraz being an Iranian city and the history of it, does much come out of the Middle East still in terms of wine?
No, there's not a lot. There is not a lot. So basically all of the grapevine material in Australia originates from Europe, and a majority of it's really from France, Spain, Italy, Portugal, and Germany. There's the link between Syrah in Persia and the variety of and the grape variety of the same name is cloudy. It's certainly linked, but for all intents and purposes, all the Shiraz grapes in Australia came here from the Rhone Valley in France, just south of Lyon. It's the historical home. The link between the Rhone and Persia, it escapes me, but I know there is a link, but it is not. It's not as direct as the name implies.
It's really getting your nerd on, Wilf.
Yeah. Well, look, a couple of bottles of wine, I'll say anything.
Stuart, there's a question from Al Calloway in the chat about how important is the label for marketing the vintage for you, or do you rely more on the brand?
It's both. I think one of the things, so Brokenwood's label's relatively iconic, both the Brokenwood and the cricket pitch label. They really haven't changed much over our 50 years. It's been, so we've worked quite hard not to keep the label relatively true. Vintage matters. It's what really sets wine apart from any other drink on the market, in that look, regardless of our winemaking ability, the vintage drives our quality. And that's different to something like beer or spirits, in that if you're a whiskey distiller or a beer brewer, if it's a really tough barley harvest, the impact on your flavour is not going to be dramatic. It's certainly going to impact what you pay for your barley and how easily you can get it. But there's a reason Tanqueray gin tastes the same everywhere, every year. There's a reason widely made beers taste the same everywhere you drink. Sorry, it's the raw produce isn't the determinant of quality. It's much more of a production drives the quality. Wine's all vintage. It's particularly at the top end. Things like our Graveyard Vineyard Shiraz, for example, we just don't make it every year. So we didn't make one in 2020. We didn't make one in 2016. When you get a year like 17, 18 or 19, it's a big thing. 2018 and years like 18 and 14 are two of the greatest vintages that we've had in the last 20 years. You just can't replicate it. It's the best comparison I can give is having a wonderful fresh vegetable drawer and cooking with that, as opposed to cooking with what's left at the vegetable drawer 10 days later. There's a relatively defined ceiling that you can achieve with lower quality produce, and that's really what comes on from the season. The hard work is in the great season. Not, I guess the onus is more on to not bugger it up, for want of a better term, than trying to extricate something from a tougher situation.
So Stuart, does that mean that you basically start from scratch every time? You don't go, this is cricket pitch, therefore it's going to be the same process as last year, it's just from scratch?
It's somewhere between, look, I certainly know which vineyards have the pedigree. So our best blocks, even in a challenging year, our best blocks, even if they don't look that crash hot, they stack up. They come to, they might not look so good straight away in the bin or at harvest, but after a few months in barrel, the best blocks really tend to look after themselves. Blocks that are a bit bigger that might go into our cricket, that might make a component of our cricket pitch red, it's not always the greatest vineyard, but there's consistency to it. And the other thing with cricket pitch is there's a lot more of it made. So cricket pitch red is our largest made red. We make about 13,000 cases of that wine, whereas to give you an idea, the Hunter Valley Shiraz is in depending on the year 2 to 3,000 cases. So it's much smaller make, and then our graveyard Shiraz is only a few hundred cases. So there's those better blocks certainly get the Rolls-Royce treatment, but a lot of that is based on prior experience of knowing where to put the focus.
Okay, so another question, I'm going to skip back to JP in a minute, but Stephen Wentworth's just said, you've spoken about the raw input and how that affects the end product. How do you see climate change then impacting your wines, short, medium and long term?
So there's Wine Australia put out a pretty quite incredible report late last year on the impacts of climate change on the wine industry, and going on what we've experienced up here over the last sort of 10 years. I don't think where we're based in the Hunter Valley, numbers say that we're probably hot enough. There's probably a ceiling to how much hotter we can get, but I think the risk for the Hunter is variability. That's certainly the biggest thing we're worried about. Like, so in terms of more intense storms, that storm factor is the thing that probably keeps us awake at night a little bit more than most. I think we have because of our location, both in terms of proximity to the coast and latitude, rainfall tends not to be too. I think the rainfall impact, whilst drought certainly impact us here in 20, it's not at the level of other regions. But that variability of storms, whether that be late season frost, is a big impact that I think we have the potential to see more of. But those late summer storms that rip through and drop 2 inches a week out from harvest, maybe with a little lick of hail just to keep you on your toes, they're probably the things that really they're the things that sort of we're the most conscious of here. It's a concern. There's no. We look at the fires from coming into vintage 20. Those fires, we had smoke here in October. Like it was, and granted, we were coming off sort of 3 consecutive dry years whereby the place was just brown and dry, but that's pretty early to know you're in trouble. And I think there's no probably better. I guess one of the things here at Brokenwood we've done over the last few years, we're based here in the Hunter Valley, but we do take fruit from multiple different regions. We take fruit from the Hunter Valley, Orange in central New South Wales, Gundagai, Beechworth, McLaren Vale in South Australia. And that's held us in incredible stead over the years, because we have a little catchphrase of sort of all the right regions for all the right reasons. And what that really means is that if one of those regions isn't up to scratch, invariably one of them is very good. In 20, everywhere was touched up. Like we had smoke in every one of those regions except McLaren Vale, and McLaren Vale was down 50% on yield. So it was just like that widespread nature of it really focused the mind, I think, in terms of how vulnerable we are to that. And as I said, the vintage determines quality, and if we have a tough one, it's tough.
Fair enough. So question from JP Van Mort. What's the next big thing for the Hunter and New South Wales to sustain domestic wine consumption and wine tourism once people are allowed to travel again?
I was going to say open up. Look, I guess I didn't touch on this with COVID earlier, but one of the bright spots in the last 18 months was when we did open up late last year. Demand here in the Hunter Valley and domestic tourism was through the roof. It was quite incredible, and it was really good. I think we had people coming up here that hadn't been up here in 10, 20 years, to be honest, and getting just that impetus to get to the regions. I think if one thing COVID's taught us is that local matters and local's important, and it's a damn shame it's taken a disaster to, I think, for people to think of that. But one of the tough things I guess the Hunter Valley is Sydney's local wine producer, and I think it's a pretty cool opportunity to rediscover what's going on up here, but also out in Orange, Canberra, Mudgee, and and just see what's out there. There's incredible diversity here in New South Wales. I think we undersell ourselves. I think a combination between underselling ourselves in terms of the diversity and abundance that we have here in New South Wales, but also I think as New South Welshmen and women, we are the least parochial state in the country, and we want what's best. And I think it's been a nice reminder of how good the quality is here, not just in the Hunter, but around New South Wales.
You think some of those people that have rediscovered the Hunter Valley will come back as well as, or instead of going to their overseas holiday or some other state?
I think the window, I think we'll be very busy when we open up here at the end of this month. I think demand will be very strong. I think it will be a shorter window than what we had last year, though, because of that. I think when international borders open up, I think there's a fair bit of pent-up demand to go and see somewhere that's not Australia at the moment. But we're certainly looking forward to both having domestic visitors, but also internationals get back here when they can. I think that pent-up international demand goes both ways as well. I think there's good pent-up demand from what we see internationally, maybe not as much from the French and Chinese market as we maybe thought, but that will pass.
All right. Are there any other questions for Stuart, either on the wine tastings, the wines, or industry generally?
Stuart, Michael Shields, how you doing?
Oh, g'day, Shieldsy.
How are you?
Well.
You talk about drought 2020 and what have you. What sort of impact does that put on the actual vines, and do they recover fairly quickly?
They didn't bounce back as well into 21 as we, or maybe as we'd hoped. They probably did what we expected. They got themselves in good shape. I think it's really a 2-year turnaround for permanent plantings after that stress level. I think running into coming into this season, into 22, it looks like a very healthy crop. I think across, but then you look at that drought was quite widespread. We look at the national crush for 21, it's a record crush. So the vines bounce back. Water allocation matters. It's not a big thing here in the Hunter Valley, but those warm inland regions, the impact of water allocation and I guess the use of that water on other assets shows that vines do bounce back, but they need a lot to get them back up. That was probably one of the blessings with all the smoke last year, was that we didn't have burnt out vineyards. But one of the things with smoke, it impacts your year. That in fact impacts your wine from that year, but it doesn't carry over. If you're down the Adelaide Hills or Tumbarumba and you burnt your vineyard, that's really a 5-year project between ripping out those vines that have died due to the fires, retrellising, re-establishing vines, and it's sort of a 5-year window from planting through to a commercial crop. So look, we haven't had as wet a winter here as down south, but I think South Australia, Victoria, they are on track for a lot of fruit this year.